My name is Bernadette Divilly. I'm a dance artist living in the west of Ireland. In 2020, I interviewed Barbara Dilley. Barbara is the creator of contemplative dance practices. The interview happened at the Naropa University during Dance Art Lab. This is a place where practitioners of Barbara's work continue to evolve, translate and develop the work. I hope you enjoy this interview.
But yes, influence, I feel like within the context of what, Dance Art Lab is very much about the coming together of individuals who have experience and hauntings and have curiosity and longing. That the idea of coming into the room together changes everybody. I used to say to people, to students, I am different because you are here. And so that's a level of influence. And so all of you are receiving different levels of influence from each other throughout the investigations and the stillness and the movement, and it's very potent, it's very powerful, and it's intended, it's very much an intended exchange. I mean, it comes at the level of, you exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide in the same room together. You're actually exchanging the inside out into the space, and then I'm breathing that inside into my inside. So there's a circulation. Influence is part of a kind of circulation on one level of alone and together is a way of talking about being in an ensemble, and the together part is very much that study we have of being, what are they doing? This is how they do things. This is how she's lifting her arm. This is the tempo that they're going, that kind of influence. But there's also the need to be alone, that I'm sleepy now, or I'm brokenhearted now, or I have a sore knee now, or whatever. And so that dynamic between being alone and together is very much, I think, built into the investigation into influence. Then there's just the play of influence. Influence as an instruction into the ensemble, go out there and take influence or put it down. That's, for me, the basic instruction, is to become cognizant, to learn to see it, to recognize it in the movement field or other dimensions of the field of the ensemble. To recognize that and be able to yield into it or put it down. It's very important in improvisational play. So we're talking about deep play, and to be able to play with relaxation and ease, and to have it be restorative and not create a lot of anxiety, you have to be able to put the influence down. Nobody had ever really talked about body-mind until I got out here.
Okay.
Yeah, this was 1974 was the first summer I was at Naropa. And even, I would say, even then, body-mind was not being talked about. But mind was being talked about. I mean, not only by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, but also by Ram Dass, who just died. You know that. Bless dear Ram Dass.
Oh, wow.
Yes, he passed about 2 weeks ago. Somehow he was in Hawaii.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And So that first summer was very much about one night we'd be listening to Ram Dass, and the next night we'd be listening to Trungpa Rinpoche. You know, and they were giving variations on the spiritual journey and the disciplines of that journey and the history of that journey and the context, and it was very dynamic, it was very rich. I came with a lot of history and background and training, but I was being asked to create a dance program at Naropa. This was 19. That at the end of that summer in '74, I received the invitation, and then I came back in the summer of '75, and we got together, the faculty in the various disciplines, and began to create a catalog. I think was our main task. So it was like, oh my God, this is a blank sheet of paper, you know. How do you train dancers in 1974? I mean, what was the vision? What was the interest? What was possible? Where was I? What was happening here? I mean, it wasn't New York anymore, which is where I'd come from, which was, you know, very dynamic at that period of time. The late 60s, early 70s, a lot of experimental, rich experimental, amazing work. You talk about influence. I was just being influenced, you know, every pore was being influenced all the time, a lot. And then coming out here with all of that and realizing that people were showing up in the classroom that didn't have any of that, had no idea what I mean, I had to constantly, as a teacher, I had to constantly, I'm sure many of you have this experience, readjust what I was doing because the longing was so huge in the classroom, but the skill set, we didn't share the same vocabulary. So how do you, and I think this is a big teacher dynamic that goes on all the time. How do you adjust what you are hoping to offer to the people who show up and that want to receive it? And you know, you have this idea that this was what I'll do, and you start out doing that, and it just is like, not working. Definitely, you need to create a bridge, basically. What should young dancers be trained in? And what was valuable to pass along, and what could I let go of that wasn't helpful? So I was sifting through a lot of my own experience, you know, and one of the main arcs for me in those early days was the idea that everyone who graduated with a dance degree from Naropa, which was happening in those early days, should be able to go into any classroom to continue their learning in any classroom anywhere in the world. That was my goal.
Wow.
Yes. So they needed to have some structured technique. They needed to be able to know the decorum of a classical, technical environment. What were the things that were most important? So technique was one of them. Applied anatomy, which was just beginning, it was 1974, just beginning to emerge. Experiential anatomy, I should say. So, you know, body-mind centering was just getting started, release technique, all of those early explorations, Feldenkrais people, yoga, Tai Chi, new forms of movement, research, vocabulary were suddenly blossoming in New York in the late 60s and 70s. I was fascinated by it. Translate, yep, that's a good word. And it comes from, again, from the tradition that I was taking so much of my instruction from the way Trungpa Rinpoche was teaching. So his teaching modality, his structuring of teaching, what he chose to teach, in what sequence he chose to do it in, the way his language has always been very captivating to me, and the depth of integration, the intellect, the psychology, and the history, the depth of all of that, and the language that would come up. So the idea of translation, of course, he's coming out of a Tibetan culture, completely different culture, and the whole thing of learning another language. And what it is to be a translator, and the way in the Tibetan tradition, translation is revered because it offers the ability of the wisdom to go further.
So it's a giveaway.
It's a giveaway. Yeah. Very important to consider yourselves translators. It's a very personal distinction I made, and sometimes I feel a little embarrassed that I stepped into that world metaphorical. I stepped into it as a metaphor, waves and particles, which comes from quantum physics, with the idea that the particle is when we've solidified and become a very definite entity, an I, and I have to say right from the beginning that there's nothing the matter with that. That is how it is. And I think egoism gets misunderstood a lot, and it becomes, we become judgmental of ourselves because we are being egotistical or egoic or whatever. There's nothing else. That's who we are. That's what we're born into. That's it. The basic idea, as I've received it, is that it's limiting to hold it as a single particle. And if you can begin to open it up and let it be a much more elastic, or on the spectrum, so to speak, where there's a fluidity to our identity or to our sense of self. And I think that these improvisational practices that we do, we touch in on that off and on all the time, where we become very fixed, and then suddenly we're in the group and we're moving, and it doesn't, who am I? Our eyes are taking us further out into the space. There's a moment where you don't quite know how you got there. And I think that's more the wave experience. And that if there's some languaging of that for people, they can be more, we're able to release into it more. So I think finding words and ways to talk about letting that fluid experience, wave-like experience, happen and not panic with it. At the same time, allow centralizing into the particle. It's absolutely essential. It's how we exist in the world, and making friends with that. But in an environment like this, especially in embodied movement practices, that back and forth pulse can begin to be felt.
A comment just in your diction, Bernie, that it is a shift in attention. Because when the uncertainty principle was created, it was a setup to see an electron as a particle. That setup would produce a particle. If you set the test up to see a wave, that setup produces a wave.
Oh, God, isn't that amazing?
So that attention, did you feel the mind?
Oh, wow, yeah, I felt that.
So that attention is, I mean...
It just like opens a door that just blows my conceptual world. Thank you, Mary. So one of the interesting things about this concept, and I have a little video clip which I can send along to you and you can send it along to people, is that all of this changes if it's observed. That's one of the really scary, mystical bizarre things about quantum physics is that everything changes because we look at it. When we look at it, it changes. And that, I don't even know what to say about that.
Yeah.
I mean, all creative work is arises from this existence of me, myself. I think perhaps the pathway is about discipline. You know, what is it to be disciplined within our expression, so that at the point where we actually want to offer it to others as a gift of our expression, you know, there's been some kind of journey that something has gone on. And I think discipline is very potent, and it's complicated and necessary. Very basic. There are lots of different ways we can talk about discipline. I mean, there's discipline within the art form itself. You know, there's discipline of one's citizenry in the world. You know, how one is in one's community or family or society or school or job or yeah, but that would be, for me, it would be a question of evolution, that my self-expressive longing evolves through, well, all right, I'm going to shift it from a combination of discipline and play. That there's some kind of play that goes on as well as discipline, but that's the path. Yeah. How do you, as a teacher, look at students who come in the room? Who are they, and how do you actually feel toward them as they arrive? And you know, as always, sometimes the class shows up and there's just natural attraction to certain kinds of students, and then there's some kind of, oh God, that's the troublemaker, or that's the one who's always going to be late, or, you know, that's the one. Anyway, there's that kind of judgment thing. And I think graciousness, to some extent, is about working with yourself as a teacher, really trying to understand what your motivation is when you're offering an exercise or when you're talking to students. How do you make it invitational all the time? How do you constantly adapt what you're going to say so that everybody feels they're welcome? It's about inclusivity, graciousness, and about recognizing diversity. I mean, that's such a big issue these days. You know, that there's a sense of acknowledging when you've been wrong. I mean, you as the teacher-student relationship is very ancient for all of us. We began going to school when we were, what, 4, 3, 5? So, you know, you had different relationships with authority. It's authority. So you're in a position of authority. How do you create graciousness in a classroom as a person having authority? And I think over the years, I've learned to try as much as possible to be, I mean, the word now is transparent, but basically tell people what I'm trying to do, not to hide anything. To say, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to go about doing it, this is what I expect from you, this is when you can ask me questions, you know, to be very clear about the decorum of the situation, and then be true to that decorum yourself. Keep referring to it. So, because rules are necessary and structure is necessary, and the more that you say, I'm doing this in order to make it fair for everybody in the class to have 3 minutes. That's why we're doing 3-minute solos. It's not because I think 3-minute solos are the best thing in the world. It's just because there are 15 people in the class and we only have this much time. You tell them why you're doing 3-minute solos. If we were 5 people, we would do 10-minute solos or whatever. But as much as possible, you try to reveal, I think, why you're doing the things that you do, and it helps them relax. So you want to keep looking into the classroom environment and notice or feel when the atmosphere relaxes. And you can get tuned into that. There was never a lot of thought about how to do it. It was more, it happened because I got old, and I just couldn't sustain the form physically. And then I began to realize that it was a time to start letting other people take over, and Catherine and Damaris were the first ones. And the whole possibility, well, Dance Art Lab started as a research and development project by the faculty. That's how I was able to get Naropa to support the time and everything, is that I signed up a studio space as faculty to do research and development. And then it kept going, and which was fabulously unexpected. People just kept coming, showing up, and we just kept. People would say, what are the dates for next summer? And so it was watching this watching Dance Art Lab begin to have its own momentum, a life of its own, is sort of the phrase that gets said. And then I would begin to think about why is this happening? Why is this important to you? That now we're doing it in the winter as well as in the summer. Bravo, Catherine and Mary. I use these phrases that come out of the great Buddhist wisdom tradition. There's an outer, inner, and secret reason for why it keeps happening. And all of you in this room feel it on some level. There's some outer reason you're showing up. There's inner practices or inner investigations or inner healings or journeys that you're taking, and then there's the secret, the things that aren't spoken easily. So I began to realize that it was a real environment which could be a benefit to people. And that's when I began to think, how do I turn this over so that you can all go out and take it and offer it and transform it? I mean, it's a form that grew up in a particular environment, and you're going to need to transform it to meet other spaces, other groups of people, other social conditions that will come up. So those questions started arising. And then it became more a question, how can I help people do that? And Mary, you were the instigator.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, wow.
The coyote.
So one summer, it would have been around 2008, 9, something like that, Mary came up to me. It was at a Dance Art Lab summer. At the end of a session, she came up to me.
Like in the parking lot.
In the parking lot. And she caught my wandering, discursive attention and looked me in the eye and said, "Barbara, you've got to write us a book." And it's the first time that idea I'd never thought of it. Never thought of it. But as I began to think about it, I went, oh, right. I mean, what is actually happening here at Europa is not happening anywhere else in the world. Right. And it's like you can't go somewhere else and find it, you know. And so everybody who's coming out of these programs is carrying it for the first time, but it's also, it's a delicate seed, you know. Mm-hmm. So the idea of the book was to create some kind of manual of the vocabulary, the movement vocabulary, and the forms that had evolved because of Europa and because the people came, and then who I was and where I came from. So what my influences were and what my background was, so that there wasn't any confusion about that, because those two things were what created this experience. And then the hope was that you as teachers could see that you too could have a story and have influences and have, that you didn't have to be me, you know, you could be who you were and have your story, and you could take some of this vocabulary, some of these exercises, some of these classroom practices and bring them forward and adapt them. So it's always been this question of adapting. There's at the end of the book, there's the Ants Manifesto, which was something that we used back in the day. At one point, I was doing, for a couple of years, I did a project called Desolate Delight, and the Ants Manifesto came up at that time, and it's a beautiful expression of ensemble improvisation. It's just beautiful poetry. My great delight has been realizing that I've received so many amazing instructions about how to work with my mind, and that I'm gifted with this opportunity right now to settle down into my mind practices more and more and more. And of course, they're body-mind practices. And for me, I think they are intentionally also, you know. But I sit on my meditation cushion and locate my central axis, and you know, I had a hip replacement, so that's been physically very psychologically very stimulating. And you know, just integrating and finding alignment again. But the philosophy and path and wisdom of Buddha Dharma is what I'm basically addressing. How powerful that is for me at this point in my life, and how grateful. I can't believe my good fortune that I was able to receive instruction, and that I have enough faculty left in me right now that I can actually know where to go to remember what it was and that kind of thing. It's easy to forget. Can we celebrate?
Yes.
Thank you.